Dan, we are so excited to have you with us today. Welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. And we'd love it if you just start off with some opening comments and then we'll go to questions.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for including me. It's great to be with you today. So I thought what I would do, this is a very big and broad topic. So try to take a few minutes to frame it, talk a little bit about what AI is, some current developments in AI, and then get to the question really on the table of AI and the implications and the Constitution, and then to provide some resources. There's lots of reading material, but some resources that I've relied upon to prepare for today. So let's just jump right in. So to begin with, what is artificial intelligence and how is it used? So artificial intelligence refers to the simulation of human intelligence by software. Nowadays, this code is prevalent in everything from cloud-based enterprise applications to consumer apps and even embedded firmware. 2022 was really when AI began to explode and became more mainstream, with applications of Chat GPT, which stands for Generative Pre-training Transformer. And the widespread fascination with Chat GPT makes it synonymous with AI in the minds of most people. But we need to keep in mind that Chat GPT is really just a small portion of what AI is and how it's being used. The ideal characteristic of AI is its ability to rationalize and take actions that have the best chance of achieving a specific goal. A subset of AI is machine learning, which refers to the concept that computer programs can automatically learn from and adapt to new data without being assisted by humans. Some examples of how AI is being used. I mean, it's being used today across a variety of different industries, from finance to healthcare. We talk a little bit about kinds of AI, weak and strong AI, but weak AI tends to be simple and single task oriented, while strong AI carries on tasks that are more complex and human-like. We need to spend some time today, and I'm sure we will. As I said, there's a wide spectrum of opinion. There are some critics who fear that extensive use of AI can have a negative effect on society. One of those I wanted to draw attention to this because this just happened last week. There's a story in the New York Times yesterday. The godfather of AI leaves Google and warns of danger ahead. This gentleman's name is Geoffrey Hinton, and he's a 75-year-old British expat. He's an academic, but his lifelong pursuit has been AI. He last week quit his job at Google, where he worked for more than a decade, and became one of the most respected voices in the field, so that he could freely speak out about the risk of AI. And what's really dramatic about part of what he said was that, and he's 75 years old, but he regrets his life's work. His concern, I'd say in general, and you can find it in the New York Times, but is that AI can be a tool for misinformation, and it can be a risk to jobs, and somewhere down the road, in his opinion, it could be a risk to humanity. There was a broad letter, which I'm sure many folks are aware of, it was about to the start of OpenAI, which is responsible for Chat GPT, last month, or more than, actually it was in March, so 2 months ago, more than 1,000 technology leaders and experts signed an open letter calling for a 6-month moratorium on the development of new systems of AI, because in their opinion, it poses a profound risk to society and humanity. And I'm sure we'll come back and talk about that during our session. Turning to the issue at hand, AI and the Constitution. A couple of things to mention. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy last fall, the Biden administration issued a Bill of Rights, an AI Bill of Rights for an AI-powered world. And that's relevant for our discussion today, of course, because, after ratifying the Constitution, we adopted the Bill of Rights to guard against the powerful government we just created. So enumerating guarantees such as freedom of expression and assembly, right to due process and fair trials, and protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Those are all, and I've got some examples of those to get to in a minute. Those are all issues that are implicated in AI, and just things that we have to keep in mind. In addition, the effect of AI and civil rights and civil liberties, and ensuring that the information about you is fair, accurate, and unbiased. I've collected, and I think Kathy will post in the chat, like I said, the broad spectrum of opinions, some articles that I read preparing for this, and I'll just go through a couple. One, there's a paper, these are law review articles, The Coming Onslaught of Algorithmic Fairness and Regulations by my friend Neil Chilson and Adam Thier. Another paper is Regulation, The Risk of AI by Margot Kaminsky. A paper entitled Data Informed Duties in AI Development by Frank Pasquale. The next, and I'm going to draw some examples from in just a second, The Automated Administrative State, A Crisis in Legitimacy authored by Ryan Calo and Daniel Citron at University of Virginia. And last but certainly not least, I'd commend all these articles to you, but this one in particular, The Law of AI for Good by Ori Lobel. So just real quick as we get into our discussion, the paper that resonated, I mean, of all those, the Lobel paper is really worthwhile. But the Calo and Citron paper, a discussion of technology due process. And so their paper, there's a clear discussion of the implications of AI and free speech, First Amendment. You have all sorts of new issues, right? Human, I mean, obviously the First Amendment applies to humans, but, chat bots and things like Chat GPT, how does the First Amendment work in a non-human context? Next is Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. 14th Amendment, due process. The Calo Citron paper drew a number of examples and talked about technology due process, but among them was, the Arkansas Department of Human Services used automated decision-making in some of their healthcare services, and it wound up being discriminatory and people were not cared for, and they wound up in federal court. So we've talked about the First Amendment, the implications of chatbots and protected speech. You've got intellectual property issues, copyright issues of rights and limitations, and administrative functions and transparency. The one thing that's very clear, and I'll close with this, is that all of the opinions about this, the risk is absolutely new. Having served in government, I'd say my own opinion is I'm always optimistic about new technology. I believe in the Constitution and the role of the founders, and America is an innovative place and entrepreneurial. So my own opinion is that while this is very challenging and there are some very new issues, that we will get it right. But that's not a shared opinion. And we can also, in discussion, we can talk about Europeans and the way that transatlantic is going with all this. But to sum up, there is no subtle law here. So it's great that, Kathy, that you're kicking off this discussion. the courts are increasingly worried about these issues. And I think as we all, go forth into the world of AI, we need to consider multiple scenarios about how this will play out, because it's being aware of those risks and then taking precautions, but also thinking about all the different interactions is the way that I think it will, is in the United States, will drive us to the best outcome. So I'll turn it back to you, Kathy. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. That was a great overview. And I really appreciated your outlining some of the differences between Chat GPT and AI, because it all seems to blend together these days. But I'd like to go to Janine first and see if she has any questions. Janine, hi.
Hi. Well, sure. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Caprio. And I was given a speech in a school, so I jumped on late to this, but I did hear the last half of it, and I appreciate all of your perspectives that you're giving us and explanations. What you may have answered this, and I'm sorry if you did, but what I'm concerned about is how do we get a handle on who is programming, who's feeding the information into the chat boxes and the whatnot, and all that information is going to be spit out that everyone's going to take as face value, that it's absolutely right. I mean, I think there's a responsibility that the people that are programming it and aren't the people that just have one opinion about something, because that's, humans have the ability to reason. And I guess a computer has the ability, or, to kind of go find answers, but can't really reason. And it's that ability in our country with our freedoms that we can debate with each other and reason that have kept us, free and we're still in existence. And I'm worried about these that not existing in the future robots and chat boxes and things of that nature.
Sure, that's a great question, and please call me Dan. But you just put your finger really on two of the most important issues. I mean, for the public and for policymakers, the issue of transparency, what goes in the algorithm, and then number two, how do we make sure that the algorithm is not biased? So there is, I mentioned the White House, the Artificial Intelligence Bill of Rights. There's a lot of discussion in there about the need for transparency. Many of the companies, not all the companies that are involved in AI, understand the kind of, what, to your point, Janine, the interdisciplinary nature, that you need to have teams of people that are feeding the algorithm that represent a lot of different points of view. A monolithic perspective does not lead to a good algorithm. And then you really have to, as you're programming and thinking about algorithms, you have to really sort of ask the honest question of, is there unconscious or inherent bias? I mean, none of us wake up in the morning and want to be biased in anything that we do, but sometimes, in training an algorithm, it can creep in, and so there's a lot of discussion, among app developers and among policymakers of how do you, just being aware of the bias and making sure that the bias is not evident, in the training of the AI algorithm.
How is that done? I mean, if we, the people, were to reach out to our representatives and say, we're very concerned about this and we think this should be done, how is that even regulated? It's, because you can only regulate, a lot of these are private industries, and there's just, you can regulate to a certain extent, but that's the danger. I mean, I saw a wonderful interview with one particular person who does this type of thing, talking about another entity that does this type of thing. And I just won't say who, because it immediately makes people go. And he was talking about how this particular person said, well, these entities have the potentiality of becoming sort of like God, and destroying civilization. And the other entity says, well, what do we care? You know, we're going to make money, and it's a good thing. And call the other person a speciesist. I don't even know what a speciesist is, but I guess it's a person who cares more about the human species than about, you know, technology and making money. So that's the danger. You've got the already it's out there and unleashed. So if we were to call our representatives, I mean, what do we say? This is the thing that I think people are feeling very nervous about this, because we feel very powerless about this leapfrog in front of us. What if you could pinpoint it to sort of one petition heading, what would it be?
That's a great question. And having done technology policy for most of my adult life, the one thing that's different about this is and you've seen it with Chat GPT, it's moving so quickly. And it's very hard, especially for elected representatives for Congress, where Kathy and I have known each other for a long, long, long time, for Congress to keep up. But I do think, and this is not a partisan issue, this is a bipartisan issue. There needs to be a bipartisan solution. I do think what we need, you know, with our representatives is, and you know, the headline is, we're going to need to figure out some regulation, which is not something I'm usually for. But I think we're going to have the potential. There's potential for lots of opportunities. There's potential for lots of challenges. But this is moving so fast. That was the point of, I don't know if you heard, but I was referring to a New York Times article yesterday about the godfather of the internet, or the godfather of AI, 75-year-old gentleman at Google who just resigned because he's concerned of what he's created. This is moving so fast that we're going to have to, I mean, you know, the executive branch, the legislative branch, are going to have to work together, the independent agencies, Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, and come up with some solutions, some regulations that put some guardrails around this.
Well, okay. That sounds as nebulous. It's just like, okay. Last question before I toss it over to Tova. You know, this is a similar situation that we're in, is that America may try to be altruistic and do the right thing, but that doesn't mean North Korea will, or China will, and these other countries will. And I think it's the same thing with climate change. America's trying to do the right thing, but they're not doing it in India. They're not doing it where they have 1.5 billion people in China. So it's sort of like we're spinning our wheels. We're in a rut and we can't get out. I mean, what do we do? China's not, I mean, this is just like these movies that we've always seen. It's just like, you know, the futuristic movies where you have the bad guys coming to take over the earth, and now it's all in, you know, electronics, and it's sort of coming true. Because how do we, if we try to do the right thing in our country, what are we going to do? These other countries can say, I'm going to use this to my advantage to gain power and take over the whole world.
Well, two thoughts. And Kathy mentioned, I've spent a good part of my career in transatlantic US-EU relationships. The US and the EU are working, I mean, the European Union has taken a very different approach to regulation. It's what's called the precautionary principle. They have an EU AI Act, but we are working with the Europeans on what's called the trade and technology dialogue. And we are trying to come up with sort of common solutions around, and maybe this is more specific to the first question you just asked, Janine, but to sort of, how do we manage in the transatlantic, the trade and technology dialogue with AI, how do we manage risk, and what does that mean? Which turns out to be pretty significant. The other point, and I mentioned this in the beginning, and you just mentioned it, Janine, is China. So the problem with the idea of a 6-month pause, you know, the Chinese are going to continue, and they are continuing to develop AI. So this is moving so quickly. I mean, and that's why I mentioned the AI for Good article at the beginning, which is worth reading. But we cannot, this is a national security and an economic security issue. We cannot have, in my opinion, we can't afford a 6-month pause, because that just gives the Chinese another, you know, 6-month advantage.
Yeah. Well, my closing comment on this will just be all these things take electricity. You know, they take power to run. You know, if anyone saw 2001 Space Odyssey, you just kind of can unplug it, you know. But I think in a weird sort of way, whoever controls energy can control this, because if we don't have enough energy to keep our machines going and running, and the cars running like what we're moving to, which I think is great to keep the planet wonderful. I love nature, and there's no bigger tree hugger than I, but you know, energy is a big part of this, really, because I think about that. So, okay, I'm going to toss this to Tova. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Janine. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, enjoy you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this great overview. Following up on Janine's question, I wanted to ask, taking a more wide view of the future of AI development, do you see this as that it will develop in more of a competitive way, sort of like another Cold War, where each country is sort of developing their own technology, sort of hiding it from each other at like breakneck speed to get an advantage? Or do you see that it could potentially be more collaborative, where you have different countries and innovators sort of working cross borders together? And what do you think is the better option for the future with, you know, the reality we're living in?
Well, that's a great question. I think there are multiple scenarios encompassed in that question, but I think of the two, and Janine and I just talked about this, I think the challenge with China, North Korea, Russia, I mean, those are real challenges. You know, it's the crisis of our generation. I mean, you know, years ago we had you know, we were in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. You know, the United States happened to prevail in that conflict, but the world is a very different place now, particularly with China. So I think I favor, you know, a more collaborative approach, but we also have to be realistic about the conflict or the role the Chinese are playing. So I mentioned our work with the European Commission, with the US and EU. The EU approach is very regulatory. They've already, you know, they're in the process, even this week, of, you know, finishing regulation of AI, and what does it mean to manage all these systems. But that's always been their approach, to sort of pass regulation first. You know, the approach in the US has been to sort of allow for a dynamic environment and for things like Chat GPT to flourish and to train the model and to get better, and then to, you know, sort of fix it as we go. So I do think there's a lot of common ground between the US and the EU to come up with collaborative approaches. That's not to say that the regulatory environment that I can imagine in the US needs to look exactly like it does in the EU, but I think there is, you know, sort of going back to the Constitution, there is something about the relationship between the US and the EU and kind of shared democratic values, where in countries where we share the same values, we need to find collaborative approaches for things like AI.
Yeah, thank you. And on that note, you know, I saw in your bio that you're a representative for the US delegation, as you said, charged with revisiting security guidelines, forming the basis for the first White House strategy to secure cyberspace for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So can you talk about like what that means, what these security guidelines are, and then just the general larger process of how countries work together to sort of coordinate cybersecurity regulations and policy?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. So the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. I was fortunate enough to be able to do that work with the OECD on what became the first cybersecurity guidelines in the US 20 years ago. So the first question you just asked was about the bilateral relationships between the U.S. and the EU, or the U.S. and China. There is, with the OECD, that's a multilateral organization. It was formed after World War II, part of the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. And it also includes the English-speaking countries in Asia Pacific. But in a government-to-government sense, it's a multilateral forum, because I think there's 35 countries that participate in the OECD. So the OECD is in the process of coming up with recommendations. To Janine's question, the OECD is coming up, or trying to make recommendations about what the future of AI is and what a multilateral approach should be. And I know that sounds kind of mushy, but it's really not, because the OECD is having been a part of their work for more than 20 years, they're a place where they're a trusted entity where serious work gets done. So I can drop that link into the chat too, because they're, as we move forward with this, the work of the OECD is very important because of the experts that they have and the reputation and the work that they do, that sort of provides constructive guidelines. In the case of the first, our first national cybersecurity strategy, it was after 9/11 when we realized that the United States realized we needed a cybersecurity strategy, and we took existing OECD guidelines on information systems and networks, worked in that multilateral setting with all those countries, and then brought the guidelines that we worked through the OECD back to the US. And that was President Bush, our first White House, our first national cybersecurity strategy. And that's continued to evolve since. President Obama had a cybersecurity strategy, President Trump, President Biden. It actually goes back, in some ways goes back to the Reagan administration, but the OECD is kind of a progressive movement of policy, which is why it's important that they're involved in AI. Unlike cybersecurity, which we've been doing for 25 or 30 years, and one strategy is like a building block for the next strategy, we're not starting from scratch, but we're starting new with AI. And that's where we really need the work and the help of the OECD.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating how new this technology is, and we're just now, starting to figure out how to deal with it. And on that note, we've talked about the role of the executive and the legislative branch in AI policy, but I wanted to ask about the role of the judicial branch. So there are sort of inevitably going to be these constitutional questions about, AI. You could name any number of them. And when these do go to the courts, I can just imagine it'll be very difficult because these judges, like any of us, are not, AI experts, they're not technology experts. And this technology is so new that they might not have a grasp on it. And then, just also because there's not really a precedent in court cases to go back on for some issues, for instance, maybe with self-driving cars or something like that, with, data privacy. So, do you see this being a challenge for the future? And then, are the courts going to have a very large role in shaping how AI will be implemented in the US, or will that fall to more regulatory bodies, or will the developers of this technology sort of have more of a free rein because it's such uncharted territory?
It's a huge challenge. And like I said at the beginning, there is no set of law except for the enduring power of the Constitution. I think by the time a case works its way all the way to the Supreme Court, the circuits along the way tend to, sort of get to the core of the issue. So I think it will be a challenge. I think the courts are up for the challenge, but it's going to be a little unsettled, I think, for a while. And I think there, as I said earlier, there is a risk that needs to be managed in there, because, and I mentioned the implications, say, of the First Amendment. I mean, the issues between, as humans, we're protected by the First Amendment. But what about the non-human, or what's generated by AI? So I think that the courts will, I have a lot of faith in the Supreme Court, in the federal judicial system. I think, that they're smart, they will study, and they will get it right if something changes and it needs to adapt. And I think the court, has shown the propensity to be able to adapt to changing technology. And so you said earlier, I'm fairly optimistic about the way this plays out, but I think the court's up for the challenge.
Yeah, that's good. That's good to end on that optimistic note. And then I was also wanted to ask, on this note, like, how do you recommend that people in the U.S., whether they're lawmakers who are going to have to legislate on this, or just everyday Americans like us, how do you recommend educating ourselves at this point on AI technology, on the risks of it? Or do you sort of see a future where this knowledge of AI is kind of limited to highly specialized experts? And what's the danger in that?
Well, I think the best with any new technology, and AI or Chat GPT is a perfect example. The best way to understand it is to use it, and to realize what it can do and what it can't do. And so, if I was a legislator, and I know a lot of legislative staff are using it. I know many of you are probably using it. I've used it. It does automate a lot of mundane tasks. And it really does, in sort of the questions you can ask, it provides a first draft. But you have to think of it that way. And so, to your question, I think the best way to understand it is to use it, to not be afraid of it, but just use it.
I love that. Just use it. And then my final question, going back to sort of the judicial matters, I wanted to talk about the role of our data in training these machine learning algorithms and AI algorithms. And sort of privacy issues related to that. So is our data protected, by the US Constitution? Is data considered like property? And if we put something out there, for instance, on the internet, is anyone able to use it how they want? And then, where do we get into issues of like intellectual property? For instance, I know that there are some artists. I know, I love throwing a million questions into one. But for instance, I've heard there's some controversy from artists who criticize that they've sort of put out their art styles out on the internet, and then AI programs will learn based on that, and then you can plug in a prompt to an AI program, and it'll spit out an image that looks similar to real artists' work. But is that technically that, like, is that theft? Is that crossing a line because it's not their actual work, just trained on their data? I know that's a lot, but just your general thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, no, it's another excellent question. I mentioned the well, let me take a step back. So in the United States, unrelated to AI, but privacy is unregulated. We need a comprehensive federal privacy law that sort of sets, and we've been working on this for 25 years. But we need to work harder on it because that law needs to pass, because people need to know what's happening to their data. But you put your finger on a couple of, you mentioned the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. I mentioned the 14th Amendment, due process, and some of the concerns in the Kalo Citron paper. The issues of, and this is what's going to be so fascinating about this, the intellectual property issues are definitely in play. The copyright issues. I read an article last week and again, this goes back to the First Amendment questions of what about non-human actors? That there was the Copyright Office ruled that you can't, that Chat GPT, for instance, can't be copyrighted because it's not a human. So we're going to have to grapple with all of that and the questions around artists and, their the rights to their material and sort of that being taken. Those are front and center. Those are questions we've been dealing with for a long time. They've just, AI just puts a different spin.
Well, thank you so much for answering my questions. I'll now pass on to Jewel and Jordan, but thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Hello, what a topic to have only an hour to talk about. But can you first say, is there a major difference between what we're calling AI and, let's say, an algorithm on top of an algorithm on top of an algorithm?
Can you give me an example of what when you say algorithm?
Well, is AI just software processes on top of another process on top of another process, or is it fundamentally different from that?
I think it's fundamentally different. So I'm glad you asked this question because I was hoping to get into this. I think there are four different types of AI. So I'll give you the examples, and then I'll tell you what I think they are, and then try to give you some examples. So, and I mentioned strong AI and weak AI, but there's reactive AI, right? Which think about algorithms to optimize a set of inputs. So that's like chess playing AI, for instance. It could tell you the best strategy to win at chess. So reactive AI tends to be fairly static. It's really unable to learn or adapt to novel situations, and so it'll give similar outputs. There's what's called limited memory AI, which can adapt to past experience and update itself. Autonomous learning, is it's short, but it's different than the reactive or static AI. There's what's called theory of mind AI, that's more complicated and more sort of fully adaptive, and that has the ability to learn and retain past experiences. So the chat bots that we're all becoming familiar with, that's that category. And then there's the self-aware AI. So Janine mentioned HAL in 2001, A Space Odyssey. That's where the AI becomes aware of its own existence. It's still in the realm of science fiction, but there are more and more serious people that are concerned about the development of self-aware AI.
Yeah, wow. So now AI, as I think the big question people have about AI is what is the big technological hurdle right now that is separating our AI from a Skynet version of AI, so to make it down to its lowest level, basically what would stop, what have we not developed yet that wouldn't allow an artificial intelligence from getting into the internet and being able to hack or write software onto your hardware?
Well, that's a great question. The RSA security conference was just last week out in San Francisco, annual gathering of all the cybersecurity experts. And so there are a lot of serious people that spend a lot of time protecting systems and networks that are very concerned about the scenario that you just raised, that AI makes defending the network even that much harder. And so cyber on its best day is very difficult. So protecting cybersecurity and all the different sectors of cyber, all the different critical assets that we have to protect. But that artificial intelligence just makes the job that much more difficult. I don't know that anyone has an answer to it, but there is growing awareness that it's an issue that we have to contend with.
Yeah, Jordan.
Yeah, so I was actually just looking at, I just saw a commercial for a child's doll that is outfitted with AI, and it's a learning device. So, well, first, what kind of AI would you presume that would be? Which of the types that you mentioned? And second, wouldn't it seems to me so easy to be able to guide a child in any direction that the manufacturer would choose, or a hacker could choose, if that's what you're giving your child to play with.
Well, I think from the scenario, sounds like that's static or kind of reactive AI. The one thing that we've learned, we learned about the internet, and we're learning again, or being reminded of again with AI, is the internet was a game changer, but the laws that we had in place still applied to the internet. We had to adapt and sort of pass some new laws, but the laws that were on the books still applied. Same with AI. There was, last week, the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Board, and the Consumer Products Safety Commission all came out with a joint statement and said, and in your example, children. So we have laws to protect children. It's called COPPA, but laws, about credit, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, or laws about discrimination in housing and healthcare and financial privacy, medical privacy. All those laws still apply, and there are lots of new and novel scenarios that we're going to have to grapple with, and that's why I said we need a federal privacy bill. But all of the laws that we've had in place still apply. So you cannot, if you're have a doll that you're marketing to a child, there are requirements in federal law of what you can and can't do with that information.
And just last thing, which is kind of a comment that maybe you could respond to, and then I think Kathy will get to the audience question, so you can end it wherever you think, Kathy, or whoever will be starting up those audience questions. But the Constitution gives us a lot of tools, but it really was left to the people. We have founding fathers saying the country will go as the people go, and that the Constitution can't take the place of morality. And there almost comes a point where we're looking at the Constitution, we're looking at AI, and we know that if we clearly it's going to be against the law in pretty much every way if you're going to hurt somebody directly with it. But I wonder if we're at a point where the answer to AI is to increase the people's morality and virtue, because like any weapon, like anything, any tool could also be used as a weapon. And I don't know if a federal regulation is going to stop what's coming out of Pandora's box next.
Well, it's the horse is out of the barn, the toothpaste is out of the tube. What I was referring to was, I think we have a lot of regulated industry in the U.S. A lot of it grew out of the Great Depression 100 years ago, 90 years ago. Securities law, telecommunications law, financial. We don't have, when it comes to the internet and it comes to privacy, we don't have a federal law. We need a federal law.
Yeah, I agree.
And that baseline would then help, with the specifics of AI and other things other issues like the Internet of Things and other things. So that's what I was referring to when I said at a minimum, we need a federal privacy law to help us to begin to get a framework to begin to get our heads around AI.
Yeah, and something along the lines of when there was rules about genetic mutation. Yeah. And I think we're going to need some rules like that around AI as well, because who knows what in 10 years what we'll be talking about.
Well, no, that's a great point. And we do have laws on the books, about genetic testing and healthcare. We learned some lessons as a country from some pretty bad practices 50 years ago or so, and the laws on medical research followed. I mean, I can there's something to be learned from that, although it's an entirely different set of facts when it comes to AI.
Thank you very much. Got some audience questions now.
Well, thank you, Jewel and Jorn, and thank you, Tova and Janine. Great questions so far, and we've got a lot of audience questions as well. I want to give a quick shout out to our listeners at KKV in Las Vegas. They air podcast Monday night at 6 p.m. Pacific there on 1060 on the radio dial. And I also want to give a quick shout out to the teachers and students who are watching today. We have Robert Brescia and some of his students at Odessa Permian. We have Kimberly Hammers at Grassfield High. And we have Tanya Pomeroy with the Griffin Creek sixth graders. And we also have one of our winners on watching, Kristen Tokarev. So, and if you're a student watching or a teacher with students, please type in the chat and we'll give you a shout out too. So we love when our teachers and students in classrooms tune in. Now, I want to jump right to a question that I think is probably on everybody's minds from Robert Zimmerman. Could AI cause a war to be commenced overriding commands to stop by the government operator? Cybersecurity seems inadequate to keep up with a fast learning AI to defeat it.
So if I understand that question correctly, could AI be used to start a war? Is that the essence?
Well, could AI just start a war? Could AI just decide to launch some missiles if they learned how? Because we have AI learning right now different languages without even being asked to learn languages. Yeah. Could they, could AI hack into our defense systems?
I suppose anything is theoretically possible. In DoD and the classified world, there are lots of protections and things on the battlefield and those kinds of systems. Think about nuclear silos and out in North or South Dakota. I mean, we've done a lot to harden those systems. I think AI is as I said, is a challenge to cybersecurity. Just, I mean, in protecting critical infrastructure. But when it comes to the battlefield and DoD, I think DoD is really good at imagining scenarios and developing, I mean, gaming things out. And so I'm, my sense is that the DoD is more prepared for this, or the national security apparatus, more on top of this than say the rest of the civilian government.
And here's a question that I was wondering there too. When we asked Deborah DeMeo asked this, when we ask Siri or Alexa questions for information or request a task, is this considered AI?
It is. It's a form of AI. Yeah. It's. Okay. I mean, it's limited, but I mean, you're asking it a question and it gives you a response.
Okay. And Robert Zimmerman also just added an add-on on his question with a comment that foreign systems with nuclear warheads are not as sophisticated as the USA. Do you think there's any more of a risk with AI and foreign governments' defense systems?
Well, I think that's a great question. And we've worried about that issue since the end of the Cold War. I think that it's a serious question that I think is actually larger than just. I think there are other risks to nuclear weapons than I think there are broader risks than AI. But yeah, protecting nuclear weapons is a pretty significant problem around the world.
Okay. And Fran Pultro takes it back to the Constitution and federalism. And Fran says, I would be worried about a federal law. That means more federal power. Would it not be better to have federal oversight guidelines with definite boundaries that must be followed by the states? Then each state could work within those boundaries as each state saw fit. How do you react to that?
Well, we've seen that happen in cybersecurity. So we have 50 state. It started in California about almost 20 years ago. Breach when your system was breached. California said, "Hey, if your system's breached, you've got to give notice to consumers." Well, that was a good idea, and it spread to all 50 states. Unfortunately, we still don't have a federal standard. And the problem is, for instance, on cybersecurity or breach notification, you have 50 different state requirements. The challenge, and I'm fundamentally, a believer in the 10th Amendment. The challenge when it comes to privacy is because of the nature of the internet, that it crosses state borders. You've got, just like happened with cybersecurity, you have a number of states that have passed state privacy bills that only apply to their citizens. So for instance, California, Virginia, Colorado, Iowa just passed a law. Utah just passed a law. So the laws and the states still are the laboratories of democracy, but the laws are very different and with different emphasis. So, my conclusion is, or my thought, having done this for 25 years, is we need a federal law just to set a baseline so that a consumer, it's hard enough with everything else that we have going on in life, but we shouldn't have to worry about, in this case, are we protected by Virginia law or California law? I mean, we need a federal, you need a federal floor. States always and should, have the ability to do more. But my point was, we need that baseline understanding of a federal, what are your rights to protect data, at a federal level.
Okay, well, thank you. And we are right at the top of the hour. So I'm going to ask Janine if she'd like to make any closing comments or ask one more question before we head out.
I'm fine. I just think, Dan, I thank you so much for helping us navigate through these waters, which are, I don't know, it's kind of anybody's guess. But thank you so much for giving us all this wealth of information. And I think all the wonderful panel that we have here, and Kathy and all of you watching. So thank you so much.
Well, definitely. And we thank our audience for being with us today, and ask that everybody join us next week, Tuesday at 2 Eastern. We're going to be starting a new series, The Constitution and Dangerous Dictatorships, talking about different forms of government that do not operate like our U.S. Constitution, and comparing and contrasting them with our U.S. Constitution. So it should be fascinating, and we hope everybody will be back with us next week. So thank y'all so much.
Thanks,
Bye,
Kathy.
everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much. See
Bye.
you next week.